stupid comments are out of the way. Does that show up? Probably the red shows up the best, right? Can everybody see the screen okay? Everything's showing up fairly well. Great. So as we said, this is Physiology of Behavior. That's the name of the book. Here's a cover shot. If you purchased the physical version of the book, that's what the newest edition looks like. If you bought an older edition, it's probably got a slightly different cover photo, but again, that's not really something to worry about. Today we're going to cover Chapter 1. Right? It's going to be sort of an introduction. The main things that I want you to take away from this chapter is really, we're going to cover sort of a history of what we call behavioral neuroscience. So I want you to think about that a little bit, right? Where we were a few hundred years ago, where we are today, get everybody up on the same page. We're going to cover 400 years of scientific, I know, right? Hold on, Sasha, we're going to just take off. 400 years of scientific history. We're going to cover that just to make sure that everybody's right where we need to be, and then we're going to have some fun with it. Or I will. You can if you want. So I like to kind of start with this, hey, wait a minute, I didn't register for a biology course. This is for you psych majors who thought, I'm going to take that class because it's not going to have biology in it. No, that's the wrong answer. We are going to definitely rely on behavior or biological concepts here. I actually don't have a doctoral degree in psychology. My PhD is in anatomical sciences and neurobiology. I got my teaching start teaching anatomy and physiology for nursing students. So that's kind of where I started. I did that for a couple of years. At some community colleges in North Carolina, and then got a job here. I hate to say it, 4 years ago. Does that sound right? Yeah, I started in 2015, January 2015, so there you go, right? Don't worry, not because you're going to do well, but don't worry because that's going to be a waste of your time. You're either going to do well or you're not, and worrying is just going to hurt you. So don't worry, hang in there, we're going to get it. This class is going to be different than most other classes that you take, right? This is not going to be like other classes, not because it's not going to be me, talking to you for 2 hours. But we're going to think about things differently. We're going to use some different concepts. For those of you that are psych majors, you think about behavior, you think about groups of people doing things, you think about your mom doing things to you, makes you behave in certain ways. That's all a waste of your time. I tell people all the time, anybody taking social psychology? I told somebody to drop that once. And then she had an audible gasp. I said, you got to drop that. I was like, no, don't drop it. I mean, you have to take it for your transcript, but this class is going to be better. All right, so we're going to use biology, chemistry, and physics. Not too much in physics, but when we need to, we will. But we're going to use a lot of biology. We're going to talk a lot about some biochemistry. We're going to talk about hormones. We're going to talk about receptor structure and why that's important. I definitely want you to get down to that bottom level of thinking, right? I don't want you to think about groups of people. We're going to think about groups of ions, right? And how those groups of ions influence your behavior. And it's going to be really kind of interesting and liberating in some sense. So I really want you to kind of establish a new way of thinking about behavior, right? I don't want you to think about behavior in the same way that you did before. If you're a psych major, if you're not a psych major and you're, biology, exercise science, you're going to have a handle on the physiological concepts, hopefully. But I want you to think about the behavioral concepts now, right? So we're going to kind of plug that side of it in. We're going to bring the two sides together. It's going to be a really kind of exciting thing. In terms of how this class is going to go day to day, I really want you to kind of think about this as a carousel, right? We're going to revisit a lot of topics in this class. So if you happen to fall off, which is going to happen, don't worry. Go get a little bit of cotton candy and come back. We'll pick you up and we'll take off again, right? So we're going to keep coming around and around. Now, if you fall off so badly that you don't even remember you're at the fair, let us know, right? We'll get you to the right people to get that straightened out. But you're going to have moments where you're going to be uncomfortable with the material. You're not going to have a place to put it, right? It's going to be new stuff. Sit with that discomfort for a little bit, right? Let it settle in. And what's going to be amazing is eventually you're going to go, oh, I know where to connect that now. I've got a place to put it, and it's going to make a lot of sense to you, okay? Don't wait until April to say, I don't know what's going on because you've already had an exam. But give it a week or two, right? And then see if you can revisit that and come back to it. I also like to think about this as kind of teaching in layers, right? Okay, I'm going to throw a lot of things out there. You're not going to get it at every depth every time, right? Sometimes you're going to understand a concept deeper than others. Somebody's going to get really excited. Take a deep breath, it's fine. Somebody's going to get really excited about sleep, right? And not about sleeping in class, but about the behavior of sleep. And you're going to understand EEGs, like a professional. And then we're going to start talking about like ingestive behavior and eating and drinking, and you're going to go, I don't get any of it, right? That's going to happen, right? It's going to kind of go up and down sometimes. Just hang in there, ride the ups and downs, that's life, right? The next point here, this is important, that's why I put the phrase this is important at the end, right? So you know that. I am definitely a reductionist, okay? What that means is I'm going to seek for that bottom level explanation, right? If you go, how many of you have had Dr. Goel in social psychology, right? Great class, right? But you ask her, why did so-and-so do behavior A? And she's going to give you sort of an explanation up here, right? You ask me why they did it, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to give you a different answer. She's going to say, well, they were part of this social group and they had these norms, and because of these norms, this person should have acted aggressively in that situation. And I'm going to get down here, I'm going to say, that guy had too much testosterone and that's why he was aggressive. It had nothing to do with his groups, it was all hormonal, right? So you're going to get two different answers for the same question. We just approach things from different perspectives. Hopefully, you can pick out what's important, that's what I'm going to tell you, and you can get rid of what's not, that's probably what she told you, and you can move forward and do a better job. Does that make sense? I think all too often people forget we are all biological entities, and when you forget that, then you really lose out a major driving force for behavior, right? If you're not thinking about those behavioral concepts or those biological concepts, then how can you think about how a biological entity operates? It doesn't make any sense to me. All right, so what are we going to talk about? We'll talk about those foundations. Sasha, that's that like 400 years of science history we're going to cover. We're going to talk about natural selection and evolution. For any of you who have taken a class on evolution, we're not going to get that deep on it. I'm going to give you what you need so that you can understand what's going on. We'll briefly cover some ethics, right? A lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be research that was done on humans and other animals. So we want to kind of talk about those ethical considerations briefly so you guys know most of what we're going to talk about, at least going forward once we get through those 400 years of like no regulations, actually is stuff on the up and up. Obviously, when people 400 years ago were doing things, there wasn't some of these entities going, hey, you probably shouldn't do that. We've really advanced a lot, so we'll talk about that. Probably will not talk too much about the future here, but I don't know, if anybody's interested in a career in neuroscience, we'll see what we can do. So why is it important for us to think about this historical perspective, right? And part of that is because studying brain, studying biology, studying behavior is a rapidly developing science, right? It's a rapidly developing field, and things change constantly, right? And so what we're going to try to present to you are things that are fairly stable, things that have been stable for a while. There are going to be some tweaks here and there that you might find interesting. So one of the big sort of debates that's always been going on is about the brain, and does the brain change, right? Most people say the brain doesn't change in adulthood. That was kind of the historical perspective. Once you're an adult, your brain's what it is. Now, for those of you who know anything about learning and memory, you're like, well, that's completely wrong. But on top of that, there actually is what we call neurogenesis, at least in a few areas, and we're finding more and more areas of neurogenesis. So even as an adult, you're developing new neurons, right? So you're developing new neurons. This completely changes the way we think about human behavior and human biology, right? If we thought, well, once you're an adult, your brain's what it is, okay, so then we have something that's fairly stable. Now we're thinking about something that's not, something that's changing constantly, and it really puts a different perspective on it. So it's important to think about where we were and where we are, and what it took to get us from those two locations. All right. I don't know if this is too important. We can skip that slide. Basically what we want to do here when we're taking and I think most of you probably had some basic science course, the basic idea of what we're going to do is we're going to try to described behaviors, right? Or, by using these physiological processes, we're going to take those sort of general things that happen and develop these broad laws based on those specific events. I think the other thing that's important is you want to think about why we do a behavior, right? How many of you do the same thing but for different reasons, right? Happens all the time, right? And a great example is for those of you that build nests. I'm sure some of you do this. If you're a mouse, you build a nest, right? There are two reasons a mouse might build a nest. One is it's cold, right? That makes a lot of sense. If you're cold, let's pile a bunch of stuff together to stay warm. The other reason is because they're pregnant. Okay? So it's the same behavior. They're still building a nest, but there are two different causes, right? And so we need to think about that. You don't just want to look at that external behavior. What is this person or what is this animal doing? But we want to think about what's motivating that behavior, right? And sometimes that can be a little tricky. In this example, it's easy. How do you figure out if a mouse is pregnant? Well, you turn up the heat. If it's still building a nest, it's pregnant, right? If it stops building a nest, it's because it was cold. Okay? Or you could wait like 45 days and see if there are more mice in the cage. It's the other option. It's up to you. Seems, how patient are you? Turn up the heat's a little faster, right? So there we go. And understanding physiology, understanding the underlying biological structures and the networks and things that are going on can really help us understand behaviors. Later we'll talk about language. There are two basic ways that you can read things, right? So sight words and sounding out words, or whole word versus phonetic. There are actually two different pathways in your brain that handle these two different types of reading, right? And so by understanding that we have two pathways for these two types of reading, it really makes a lot of sense to us when we start to describe these behaviors. Okay? So that's why it's important to, again, understand these biological entities that are driving and controlling these behaviors. All right, as we said, we're going to bring together two things, physiology and behavior. It's kind of tough because we're going to ask you to be sort of experts in both of those things, right? You might have a pretty good handle on one or the other, but hopefully after this you'll figure out how the two kind of dovetail together. The other thing we want to think about is, again, some of these biological roots of behavioral neuroscience, some of the process that we went through to get where we are today. This really started, people have been trying to describe other people's behavior for probably since before the human species existed, right? Other members of hominid species have been trying to describe the behaviors of other members of their species, right? It makes a lot of sense. If you can predict what someone else is going to do, then you can adjust your behavior accordingly to either avoid a bad situation or take advantage of a good situation, right? And that's what we're trying to do all day, every day. A few hundred years ago, there were sort of these two, there still are, sort of these two approaches to thinking about, thinking about life, I guess. There's the dualist approach, and that's dualist with an A, not dualist with an E. Dualists with an E are a little different, right? Those are people who shoot each other because they're like dueling, right? The dualist with an A means you think there is there's a physical body and some non-physical like mind or soul, right? And that's a perfectly fine approach, I assume, for you when you're out there, doing whatever it is you want to do with your life. For this class, though, we're going to take this monist approach, right? That's not. That's just basically saying there is matter, there is energy, and really the mind is just some phenomenon created by the nervous system, right? And then everything can be explained in these very physical matter and energy kind of terms, right? And that makes a lot of sense for our approach. If we're trying to describe something that's non-physical and not out there and actually indescribable, then it's really a waste of having a class, right? So you can be this if you want when you're out there in the world, that's fine. When you walk in this door, we're going to ask you to be monist and use that to describe behavior and things that are going on, right? Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Questions, comments, concerns? It's perfect. We will talk about models sometimes in this class. right? When I talk about a model, I'm not talking about somebody like on the cover of a magazine, and maybe that's a different class, I don't know. I'm talking about a typically mathematical or some other sort of analogy to describe a process, to describe a behavior. It's something that we use to predict things, right? We can come up with a mathematical equation that will predict whether or not you buy a bag of Doritos. That seems pretty handy, right? And then you can take into account, like, maybe there's some hunger factor, and you can add some sort of, like, concern for physical fitness factor, and then you can, like, factor in some kind of, like, I don't know, I'm thinking, like, how much money's in your pocket, right? Expendable income factor, right? You can, like, add, I'm just making things up as I go here. This sounds good, right? And you can add these things together, and you can predict what's the likelihood this guy buys a bag of Doritos, right? And so there are other things that will contribute to that. That's what I mean by a model. I forgot one important thing I should have told you for the syllabus. I don't take a break for this class, so we're going to go like a full time. I'm perfectly aware that that might not work for some of you, right? So if for some reason you need to get up and momentarily leave and then come back, feel free to do so, right? Because this is a long class, I perfectly understand that happens. Now, if you leave for like an hour and then you come back at like 6:30, you've missed one of those attendance checks. If you leave for like 10 minutes and you come back, that's not going to count against you, okay? I'm not going to wait and catch somebody going to the bathroom and go attendance time. So feel free to get up and do what you need to do and come back, okay? I just want to toss that out there. All right, so let's go on that journey. I told you 400 years, but it's going to be even longer than that, because we're going to go back to those ancient Greeks briefly and think about Epocrates. You guys remember Epocrates, right? You guys know that Hippocratic oath? Yeah, that's what this comes from. He actually thought that the brain was the center of thoughts and emotions, so that was pretty awesome, right? There were other folks who were like, no, man, it's got to be the heart. The heart made a lot of sense if you're just kind of like feeling things, right? And thinking about things from that perspective. What happens when you get mad? What happens when you get anxious? Your heart rate changes, right? And that's something you can feel. How many of you can feel when your neurons start firing? And, a particular, you can't, right? You have no idea which neurons are firing and which ones aren't. So you can't really feel that, but you can definitely feel your heart. And so when you feel these emotional responses, definitely you're going to think it might be the heart, but Hippocrates said, no, it's probably the brain. So that's kind of cool. Actually, the first folks to describe or use the word brain in a written sort of format were the ancient Egyptians. There's a papyrus that has a story about a man who was actually injured in a farm accident, and he hit his head, and then obviously had some problems after that. And so that's kind of an interesting story. A bit later, we had this guy, René Descartes. I don't know if any of you are big fans of René Descartes. Please don't raise your hand, because I'm going to make fun of him horribly today. I know, like some of you, I just saw your faces like, wait a minute. I thought that Descartes guy was pretty cool. And I guess he was, but I don't know. So Descartes is kind of known as the father of modern philosophy, right? And this is important, because I know I said we'll talk about science, but first we've got to talk about philosophy, because science was an outgrowth of that, right? And so there was a time period where everyone was really a philosopher, and then things started to shift a little bit, where we would get into the idea of actually science. And the big difference between a scientist and a philosopher is here's what a philosopher does with their day. And they just sit and think. That's what they do, right? That's what they're supposed to do. Okay? A scientist actually does things, right? If you ask a philosopher a question, they're going to go, okay, let me think about that. And they'll just think indefinitely. And they'll give you some answer that they thought about, that they felt their way to that answer. You ask a scientist a question, he's like, okay, hold on. Let's get a rock and a bag of feathers and see which one falls faster. We'll figure it out. You get down there and catch it. We'll see what happens. The philosopher is going to think about it. And they may or may not get the right answer because of that, right? But the scientist actually does things. The philosopher thinks about it. It's not me saying you shouldn't be a philosopher. I don't know. Your parents will tell you not to be one. Because most of those guys still live in their parents' basements. So there's that. So Descartes had this idea about reflexes, kind of interesting. And we'll think about reflexes a little bit. Descartes was an interesting dualist, right? He wasn't a strict dualist in the sense that you've got the body and then you've got some separate, like mind or spirit. He was like, well, you've got a body, and I bet that mind or spirit is in there somewhere. And I bet it's in that pineal gland. And I'm going to tell you it's not. Like, that's spoiler alert, right? Like, that's not. Like, you know, where these things are housed, the pineal gland may or may not be important, but it's definitely not like the seat of consciousness in the human soul. So look for it elsewhere. You're not going to find it there. He also had this interesting idea about ventricles, right? So ventricles, those of you guys that know, is like fluid-filled spaces in your brain, right? So they're kind of cool. Needs to be in there because it, circulates your cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk about that later. Descartes thought those guys, they squeezed, and when they squeezed together, it created some pneumatic pressure, right? And that made your arms and legs move. I don't know, that's not really the way, I know, right? I mean, that's just kind of a funny way to do things. So here's the kind of the brain. Descartes did a horrible job, A, drawing this brain, and B, getting it out of someone's head. So in case you have ever seen an actual human brain that someone with some skill has removed, they don't look like this. This looks like I don't know, it looks like a prune I ate last night. It's all kind of scribbled up. But right in here is this like fluid-filled area, right? So that's kind of your ventricles in the middle. Descartes got this idea. He actually went to some gardens in France. He was like walking around. They had these gardens kind of set up in an interesting way. If you were to step on certain stones, it would activate some underground pneumatic systems and would cause like statues to swing out, right, and kind of frighten people. And apparently, I think Descartes wet his pants when he saw that happen, because it had such an impact on him that he decided that that's definitely how the brain works. That's how the human body works. It's got to be it has such an impact on him. That's how that goes. So Descartes' idea there, while totally wrong, he was at least thinking about things, and he was at least like looking at the physical evidence, right? And so he was a slight step toward science and away from philosophy, even though he's known as the father of modern philosophy. The only thing I use about Descartes for my advantage, and it'll explain why I teach evening classes and not morning classes. Descartes actually died because he got up early. I know, right? You got to watch out for that, because that one will get you. Those 8 a.m. classes, fastest way into a coffin. So you should stay out of those. So as a philosopher in France, not a lot of jobs open to you. One of the primary jobs that these folks would get would be tutors, right, for the aristocrats and the royals, right? So they would teach their kids, languages and math, and that's great, right? So that's phenomenal. I would say toward the end of Descartes' life, he really wasn't that old, but he died not long after this. He got a job, got a new tutoring gig, and the guy said, hey, I want my kids to learn at like 6 a.m. Descartes' like, well, I don't really do that, but I also eat, so yeah, I'll take the job and see what happens. 6 weeks later, the guy died. Just no known reason. So yeah, getting up early will kill you. So don't try it. Anybody get up early? Well, maybe you guys will make it to midterms. We'll see. I think there were other things that probably killed him, but if you need that, get out of an early morning activity, feel free to use it. All right, so a bit later, moving a little bit, now we're in the mid-19th century, right? We're in Germany. There was this guy, Johann Müller. And Müller, this guy was pretty brilliant, actually. He really was. He was one of the first guys to say, I'm tired of people thinking. Let's actually do some stuff, right? And so what he would do is he would actually remove organs from animals. And remember, this is sort of pre-animal welfare legislation. Okay, so kind of just did these things. He would remove their organs, and then he would just expose them to different chemicals to see how they responded, right? Now, on some level, that seems sort of like a crude experiment. If we were to do that now, I'm just going to pull your heart out and then expose it to different chemicals and see what happens. When this guy was doing these things, we didn't know any of this stuff. We didn't know how these organs would respond to different chemicals, right? And so when he was doing this, these were pretty elegant experiments. They were kind of the first steps in that, approach. So he really made some great strides for us. Okay. Even though it's not necessarily an approach we would take now, but he was very forceful about taking experimental techniques and applying that to physiology. Right. Still not really thinking about behavior. Okay, we've not brought that aspect in yet. He's really thinking about just physiology. Let's take an organ. Let's put it in a different vat of chemicals. Let's see if that organ performs as it should, or if it performs better or worse. Okay? We can learn a lot from that. This is still Johann Mueller. I don't know. I don't know what happened between that guy and this guy. It's a bad before and after. So this is like too many years in the lab smelling chemicals, I think is what happened. This doesn't look happy there. But he developed probably one of the most important concepts in neuroscience, and that is what we call the doctrine of specific nerve energies. Right? And this is actually really cool. It's kind of exciting. Basically what he said is I've got a nerve. Let's pull out these nerves. Let's take a look at them. Let's see what's going through these nerves. Right? Okay, so we all kind of have a basic idea of what a nerve is, so we can think about that. He said, all of these nerves carry the same message. And that message is an electrical impulse. That's all it is, just an electrical impulse. Now later, we're going to learn it's something awesome called an action potential. Right? Okay, we'll learn specifically what that impulse is and talk in detail about that. Don't worry about it now. Just know it exists and it's out there. But Mueller was the first guy to say, hey, it's an electrical impulse. And it's all the same electrical impulse, right? And that's all it is, just electrical impulses. All you are is just a collection of electrical impulses. All of your thoughts, your behaviors, your feelings, everything you've got, if you think about it, is just this guy right here, that electrical impulse, that action potential, right? And that's definitely the reductionist in me coming out, right? And letting you know that. But I think at the same time, it's really pretty amazing, right? That everything you think, everything you say, everything you do can really be just boiled down to this action potential, right? Now, we're going to clump a bunch of those together. We put them in different patterns. It makes a different story. The other thing to think about, Trevor, is it's important where this starts and where it ends, right? If it's all just electrical impulses, how do I know if I'm seeing something? How do I know if I'm smelling something? Well, did it start in your eye or did it start in your nose, right? Where it starts and where it ends is what's important, okay? It's the same message, but the targets. The targets are what's important. All right. So now we're going to move a little bit over on the map to France. And we're going to talk about this guy, Pierre Flourens. Okay. Pierre Flourens was the father of the technique called ablation, right? So he did this thing called experimental ablation. What Flourens would do is he would take an animal, he would remove a piece of that animal's brain, and then he would see what that animal could still do or not do, right? So he removes part of the animal's brain and the animal can't open its eyes, or the animal can't walk, or the animal has trouble breathing, or different things. Then we know, well, that particular brain region was responsible for that particular behavior or physiological function, right? So he was the first guy to say, hey, that big wad of stuff you've got up here in your head, it's not all just the same. It's not all doing the same job. There are little pieces of it that are responsible for different behaviors and different functions, right? Now his approach was pretty crude, right? He's really just kind of taking a knife and just cutting out a chunk to see what happens, okay? But we do a similar approach now, right? It's not much different than some of the things we do at this point, where we would take an animal's brain and we would inactivate part of it, see if that animal can still choose between two different visual stimuli, see if that animal can still, go through a maze. If we knock out part of its, its mapping system. Okay, so we're much better at this approach, but we still use that same basic approach, right? How many of you have heard of transcranial magnetic stimulation? Okay, Casey, why have you heard of that? Well, you've been in this class
Yeah, but I also heard about it.
So the basic idea with this approach is you take a giant, super powerful magnet, not like an MRI magnet, right? Like a handheld version, and you like focus it on someone's brain. You go, all right, and then part of their brain, like a small part, just goes blank. It's done, right? Just temporarily, so don't worry about it. And then we'll ask that person questions like, hey, what's 2 + 2? You're like, geez, I don't know. Can't do math anymore, right? We're like, oh, okay, well, that part of the brain must be responsible for mathematical functions, right? And then we ask them like other things, like, hey, well, let's poke you in the ribs and see if you flinch. Well, no, you're not doing that. That must control reflexes, okay? So we do similar things now, but we have much more advanced techniques. So unfortunately, they're not letting us cut people's heads open anymore and scoop things out. We just got to shoot them with magnets. You guys can try this at home. How many of you have refrigerator magnets? Just tape one to your head. Casey, I promise this will work. If you don't want to do it yourself, how many of you live with someone? You don't have to answer that. I'm not really asking about like personal living arrangements. But if there's someone else in your house, right, you know where they sleep, and you've got some like electrical tape, I know, right? And like a big magnet, just like, didn't pay my half of the rent this month. Wonder if I can just wrap a magnet around her head and she'll forget. But I didn't pay. Worth a try. Casey, you should have been here. Anybody know about the Neuroscience Club here on campus? Anybody in that group? They occasionally ask me to come and talk to those people. They've not let me come back since the time I told them how to make like a homemade brain stimulator out of a 9-volt battery. They didn't let me back that time. You can find out how to do this. In all seriousness, you can do this. There's a how-to page online. Casey's writing that down. You're not. I think they did let me come back one more time after that. So Pierre Florenz, anyway, he made some big strides for us, figured some things out. We got that experimental ablation. Okay. A little bit after Florenz, there was another guy in France. His name was Paul Broca. How many of you have heard of Broca's area or Broca's aphasia? Yeah. Guess who that's named after? It's Paul Broca. I'm just throwing that out there for you. So Broca was a French surgeon. He sort of did the reverse of what Pierre Florenz was doing. Florenz was actively like finding an animal and cutting part of its brain out and then asking the animal to do something and seeing if it could still do it, right? Broca took a different approach. He waited until someone came in and said, hey, doc, I can't whatever anymore. And he's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Let's see what else you can't do. And then let's see what happens when you die, because I'm going to cut your head open and pull your brain out. I know, right? But we learned a lot. So there was a guy, his name was Tam. Well, they called him Tam. Tam was the only word this guy could say, right? So Tam kind of wanders into Paul Broca's office one day and just says, Tam, that's it. That's kind of all he says. And Broca's like, oh man, I got something here. And so Broca spends a lot of time studying this guy, asking what he can do, what he can't do, trying to figure things out. Tam obviously had a language problem, right? When Tam died, Broca did an autopsy on this guy, found out he was missing a particular brain region, and Broca said, that's Broca's area. I found it was missing, so that's definitely named after me now. And so then we have Broca's area and Broca's aphasia. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the language, human communication chapters. But again, you can see how this is the opposite of what Florenz was doing. Broca wasn't trying to create brain damage. He was waiting until brain damage walked in his office and then finding out what that person couldn't do and correlating that with missing or damaged brain structures. So it's kind of the inverse there of ablation. We still do this approach too, by the way. Folks have strokes, they have head injuries, they have degenerative disorders. Often they will be asked to participate in studies, and folks will ask them questions. Hey, what's going on? Can you do this? Can you do that? What behaviors can you do now that you couldn't do before? Try to figure out what's going on. When those individuals die, which believe it or not happens to everybody, so get ready for that. That was uplifting, wasn't it? You're welcome. Just wait. you know, they almost considered me as like, so I interviewed not only for this job, but pep talker. And they almost hired me for that, for all the sports teams. They were just going to bring me out, and I was going to say, well, hey guys, you know, one day you're going to die. Get out there and let's win a game.
And you did manage to find 60 subscribers?
I'm
And you
sorry.
still managed to find 60 subscribers?
I know, right? 60 subscribers. 60 people want to listen to me. 60. It's not just 60 people want to listen to me. 60 people want me to know they want to listen to me. Right? That's what's impressive about that. But some of them aren't you, and I know this. Like some of them are like random people who, and like I only have like one comment on one video. That was a video about marijuana, and the only comment was legalize it. And like it's like exclamation points. Which I felt like there were too many exclamation points for it to be a chronic user, because like at some point they're just going to go, that's too much work. Either that or they fell asleep with their finger on the exclamation. One of the two. I haven't figured it out yet. I don't think it was someone here. So we'll see. So anyway, TAM. We learned a lot about brains because of this guy. There have been other folks who've had brain injuries or removal of brains. We'll talk at some point about this guy, Phineas Gage, right? Who shot a missile through his head. That was fun. You guys might know the story of Phineas Gage. We'll talk about that later when we talk about like personalities and behavior and impulse control and things. He shot a metal like rod through his head. He was a railroad worker back in the 1800s. He had the great job of like sticking dynamite in a hole and like ramming it down in there. Yeah, I know, right? With like a sharpened metal stick, which seems like a brilliant idea. Yeah?
Question about this. Do you think we'll do this ablation on O.J. Simpson whenever he dies to see if he gets CTE?
So I mean, they're not going to remove anything. So like, I don't want to like tread into something, right? Because that's a loaded question. And you're asking a guy who spent like you know, because I was like a kid when that happened, right? It's like, oh man, this is like a big story, right? Like, what's going on here? What's wrong with the juice? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say anybody who gets whacked in the head professionally has brain damage. And that's what I'm going to say. And so that's why, so like let's bring it to like somebody a little less controversial, right? Who's not done something or may not have done something nearly as horrible as what O.J. Simpson has been accused of. And what we know he's done is just some idiotic behavior since then. At a minimum, we can say that, right? Like, we can say that. Let's think about like Cam Newton for a minute, right? I know everybody gets mad, like Cam Newton says ridiculous things, right? It says things that don't make any sense. It says things that are offensive. It's really hard for me to get mad at somebody with brain damage. I mean, it really is. And a guy who gets hit as much as these guys do in the NFL, they have brain damage. They have CTE. I don't have to take a look at the brain tissue. I'm going to say O.J. Simpson's got CTE. I mean, he's been taking hits to the head since he was probably 6, right? Because these guys have been playing football for decades, right? These constant, and we'll talk about CTE. We talk about neurodegenerative disorders later. We'll talk about that, but it's definitely, it's not even a doubt. I think it's a matter of like how bad is the CTE with these guys. Anybody who's played a contact sport for a period of time where they're getting those kinds of head bashes, it's not do you have it, it's how bad is it. And I think that's the real question. So yeah, and he may have some of the most advanced CTE. That might be what we find out. I don't know. But because yeah, I've watched lately there've been all these like, documentaries, and like Ross from Friends was in some show, right? And I was like, okay, well, whatever. And I started thinking like, man, like all these people are saying like his behavior's been erratic for a long time. We start reading these other accounts of other NFL players who've been diagnosed with CTE and they have similar erratic behavior. Like it all just matches up, and all these guys do. I mean, it's just constant. It's gonna happen. So don't hit yourself in the head. That's if you take nothing else home today, don't hit yourself in the head. Yeah. So there you go. I think that's and the thing with CTE is it's sort of widespread. Any neurodegenerative disorder, any brain injury, I always like to say it's the same rules as real estate. It's all location, 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 right? Where is the damage? Where is the degeneration? Where is the problem that you're having? That's going to be how your behavior is affected. MS is sort of a similar story. If you guys are familiar with MS, we'll talk about that some. It's a degenerative disorder with the myelination of axons. Don't worry about that too much. We'll figure it out later. But some folks with MS will have different problems. Some people have motor problems. Some people have language problems, right? It's all a matter of where does that degeneration start? Where is it the most pronounced? It's a good question. Any other questions? That's probably it. Anyway, this is in the 1860s. He did this autopsy on Tam. He was like, oh man, he's missing part of his cerebral cortex. That definitely is going to be responsible for speech. We've obviously learned a lot more since then, because now we've got these awesome things where we don't have to cut someone's head open to see what's in there, right? There are CT scans, MRIs, fMRIs, PET scans, all kinds of cool things. So we don't necessarily have to cut someone's head open to see some things. Something like CTE, we would still have to analyze brain tissue for that. Although there's a group that has recently said they actually have a blood test for CTE, which is sort of interesting. I know, right? That's the face I made too. Probably those same people that were working with Tom Brady to make the concussion-proof juice. You guys remember any of that? That was ridiculous. Tom Brady and his like, put in whatever words you want there for that guy that like trains him or whatever. They were working on this like juice you could drink that would prevent you from getting a concussion. I know, right? Like, how does that work? Unless I'm like wrapping my head in this juice, I don't see how it's going to help. I don't know. So there you go. But I don't really want to get off on Tom Brady because I have worse things to say about him than some other people. Particularly his concussion-proof juice, which is quackery. Also how they violate the NFL salary cap, but that's a whole separate story because they pay his trainer some money, which Tom Brady owns the company, so Tom Brady, I know, right? There you go, right? So Tom Brady's getting extra dollars the Patriots aren't claiming as salary cap dollars. It's a total ripoff. Hope none of you are Patriots fans. Yeah, sorry, Kyle. Go ahead, drop ad slip right outside the door. We got him out there.
Wait, what's your team? Are they playing next weekend?
They're not. I don't know. I know, right? Who does that? I still have his grade book. He's my advisee too. I know, right? I can just really screw things up. We'll see what happens. So, there you go. That's Broca and his brains. Oh, hey, there's Broca again. Here's Broca's area for those of you that are interested. Again, we'll hit this pretty hard when we talk about communication. Hey. Huh?
His haircut sucks.
I know, right? I mean, but nobody grows sideburns like that these days. I don't know what happened around 1900. The sideburn gene just completely left the human population, right? Because up until then, man, you could really grow a set. But now, there's nobody that can grow them like that. And you see guys like beard down to here, they can't grow sideburns out that far. All right, and there's this phenomenal guy, Luigi Galvani. This is kind of cool. He actually showed that electricity is the kind of the signal, right? Electricity is the communication, it's the language that our neurons are using, those brain cells, but also muscles. This is why your brain can communicate with your muscles. They're both electrically excitable tissues, right? And yes, he did this with frogs, okay? So he would take frogs and he would kind of zap them with a little bit of electricity on their leg, and guess what happened? Their legs twitched, right? I mean, that's not a real shocker. To us, it was a great pun right there. Yeah, a few of you picked up on it. Not a surprise to us, right? Kind of a surprise to these guys because, again, they didn't know, right? They didn't know at this time that that's what would happen. Galvani also has a couple other interesting points about him. How many of you have heard of galvanized metal? Yeah? It's named after Galvani, right? It's because it's an electrical process to kind of treat the metal so it won't corrode. Also, how many of you have heard of the galvanic skin response? No one's going to admit to that, right? He's like, nope, no, I don't know anything about lie detector tests. So the galvanic skin response, if you have a polygraph, they'll measure like your skin conductance, right? For those of you that have ever been stressed or not told the truth, you actually start to sweat a little bit, right? And so you have these little like, it's like micro sweat, right? And it'll change the conductance of your skin. You can pick up on that with the lie detector test. So that's named after Galvani as well. Also, the only man ever to commission a self-portrait of him with a set of frog legs. Right there at the bottom. I don't know. You think that guy had a bad haircut? Look at this thing. At least I think that's a wig. That's a wig. I mean, that's worse. I mean, whatever hair you have that comes out of your head, you can't control that. That's just, whatever comes out, comes out. Whatever color it is, however much of it you have, if it's in spirals or if it's not. But when you go intentionally, you buy something that looks like that, like he did that on purpose.
If Galvani did the experiment, like where he would actually use electricity, how did Mueller know that the signals were electrical impulses?
So Mueller was just isolating a nerve, right? Just like pulling out a single nerve. Galvani was the one who said that's what does the muscle contractions. So we didn't realize that was what was making the muscles contract. Mueller was just pulling out the individual nerve that would run like out, and he thought maybe something else was making that happen. Because they didn't really understand, and we'll talk about this later. Once you come down at the end of that neuron, there's like some little feet that come off. We'll talk about these next week. And those feet are going to interact with that membrane, right? And they didn't understand what was happening at that membrane. They still didn't hear. They didn't really understand the full extent of that movement of ions, right, which is the movement of electricity.
So Mueller didn't know that it was electric, he just saw that they were the same, so there must be something else that was different?
I'm
Or
sorry?
He didn't know there was electric?
He knew it was an electrical impulse in the nerve,
Okay.
but he didn't know once it left the nerve what that was. All right, so we've moved a few years here, 1870. We're back in Germany. We've got a couple guys here who are, because we do now have a handle on that electrical stimulation business, they're actually applying this to the surface of a dog's brain, and they're going to see what happens, right? Okay. What they found was actually kind of interesting, and something that we take for granted now, is that when they stimulated one hemisphere of the dog's brain, it was the other side of the dog's body that moved, right? And so now we all know, like, left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. I think most people have a basic understanding of that. We didn't up until about 1870, when these two guys in Germany, tried this approach. Which again, sounds like a very crude experiment, right? But how did we learn these things? We have to do these experiments. We have to actually do the work to figure these things out. And here are the two guys who did it. And now we move into the brilliant Hermann von Helmholtz. This guy was brilliant. Okay, he figured out the mathematical formulation for the law of conservation of energy. For any of you who are aware of that, if you're not, don't worry about it. It's pretty impressive. He invented the ophthalmoscope. How many of you have ever been to the eye doctor? I can tell a number of you can because you're wearing glasses, right? I can guess who that's been. Hopefully the rest of you have had eye exams as well at some point in life. Another time they shine that light in your eye and they were like looking at your retina and you're trying to not close your eye. That device was invented by Helmholtz. He actually figured out a theory of color vision and color blindness, so that was pretty impressive. Did a lot of work with audition, music, lots of other physiological processes. This guy was all over the place. Everything he touched, he was figuring out something impressive. Now, part of that, is because Helmholtz was a pretty smart guy. The other part of that is like, well, a lot of people hadn't done much work at this time, right? So it was like a lot of opportunities for him to kind of go, hey, what about color vision? Anybody done anything there? No? Well, let me do something. Spend 6 weeks on that and figure something out. But one of the cool things that he did was he measured the speed of conduction through nerves, right? So up until Helmholtz, again, people were still kind of rooted a little bit back in that philosophical approach where we can just think about it. See, previously scientists believed, it's a weird word for scientists, that conduction was this, through like biological tissue, right, through your nerves, was the same as when you're going through wires, which was just about the speed of light, which is pretty fast, right? And Helmholtz was like, well, I'm not really certain about that, but hey, there's a way to figure it out. We can just measure it, right? So what we can do is we can put these sort of little recording devices, like stick you with two pieces of metal, and then see when that electrical current passes through. Now, not quite as fast as the speed of light, still pretty fast, about 90 feet per second, right? Which is, I don't know, that's pretty fast, right? Anybody a baseball fan? Yeah, that's like going from home plate to first base in 1 second, right? And most guys who, like if you're pretty fast and you can run from home plate to first base, I mean, maybe a little under 4 seconds, right, is pretty good. And a lot of guys aren't nearly that fast. So you're talking about doing that in 1 second. 90 feet per second, that's pretty fast. And it's good. You definitely want these impulses to travel quickly. You don't want them to go too slowly, right? How many of you have ever tried to catch something that hit you in the face, that was about to hit you in the face, right? Happens all the time. If your impulses move too slowly, guess what happens? Right? You get a broken nose, yeah. It's that simple. So they need to move quickly so you can process all of these, all the incoming information. You can make those calculations. You can generate that movement, and you can, save yourself from some embarrassment. All right. So what's happened since then? Moving into the 1900s, a couple important folks. Jan Purkinje. We'll talk about Purkinje fibers later. And then there was this guy, Cahal. Cahal's an interesting guy. Cahal used something called the Golgi Stain, that's not so important, to figure out that there were individual neurons. This guy won a Nobel Prize back in 1906 for this, right? Up until this point, there was kind of this idea about all of your neurons. So like, you've got neurons and they must all be connected, right? It's one big mass, just like clumped together, right? Neurons, they're not individuals. So you had those people who were like, oh, it's all just a big mass. And then there were these folks over here like Cahal who was like, no, they're individual neurons. And they kind of battled at this for a few years. And finally Cahal said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use a special technique. We're going to turn some of these neurons into a dark color. We're going to slice this brain. We're going to put it on a microscope, and we're going to see what happens. And what happened was he got a Nobel Prize because he was right. Right? So it was definitely individual neurons. He was able to describe those, able to show axons and dendrites and cell bodies, things we'll talk about later. It's really pretty thrilling. So he kind of won the day there for that one, so got some credit. Cahal was a very interesting individual, very interested in photography and brothels. And he kind of combined his two loves into one pastime. And so he would go to brothels and hire individuals to do things. In particular, they would dress up in costumes and he would take pictures of them. Right? And I know this sounds like ridiculous, right? But you also, and it is. But you have to realize this was like, early 1900s. Photography was kind of a new thing, right? Brothels weren't. They'd been around a while. But we're going to put the two together. He was such a great patron of the brothels that when he died, right, and because he was such a famous Nobel Prize winner, right, when he died and they had his funeral procession come through town, which is as you would do if you won a Nobel Prize, right? The brothel actually closed down for the day and put up a black curtain, just in honor and mourning for Cahal. So there you go. Quick way to a Nobel Prize.
Sounds like you just made that.
I know, I wish I did, but I didn't. It's a true story. It's a true. These stories, you're not going to get these anywhere else. But these are true stories, I promise you. I know you walk in here and I'm like, the cart died because he got up early. Cahal, hired prostitutes to take photographs. It's unrealistic. Why I tell you these stories is because they require me to actually try to instill hope in you. And try to tell you, yes, you can go out and do amazing things, right? And so part of how I approach that is by telling you these are just regular people, right? Maybe Cahal was more intelligent than somebody, maybe he wasn't. He was at the right place at the right time and he was doing the right work, right? And that turned into something. And that can happen to anybody. Literally, that can happen to anybody. That can happen to a guy who hires prostitutes to dress up and take pictures, right? And if it can happen to him, it can happen to you. You guys don't do anything that weird, I hope. Some of you do, but you guys keep that to yourselves. The point is, these are just regular people, right? And I think sometimes when you hear about these amazing people, right, and you go, oh man, I'm never going to do something that amazing. Like, no, that guy was a weirdo, you know? I mean, he really was, and he was wrong about a lot of things, or he was right about a lot of things. I mean, that's, lately, one guy that's been in the news, like James Watson. I don't know if you guys are, I'm not going to ask if you're a James Watson fan, because you shouldn't raise your hand on that one. You guys know James Watson, the guy who like stole the data from Rosalind Franklin, and got him a pint of Guinness with Francis Crick, and they were like, man, that's a double helix. Then they wrote a page and a half, literally it's a page and a half paper in Science, which is like the premier journal to be in if you're a science, like one word, science, that's where you want to go. And they got a Nobel Prize for that, right? So they got a Nobel Prize for drinking and stealing, right? And I think, like I know a lot of people who drink and steal, and they didn't win Nobel Prizes, right? He also did a lot of other things, like he has made a lot of statements lately about like racial IQ differences based on genetics, right? Yeah. So finally, Cold Spring Harbor got a spine and said, you know what, we're going to take your honorary titles away because none of that's true and you're an idiot for saying those things. So they just did that like last week. It was kind of a big deal. So these are just regular people. They've got their faults. Some of them are horrible faults. It's far worse than just hiring prostitutes to take pictures, right? That seems pretty acceptable to racist and homophobic statements. So, if you're going to pick Cahal over Watson, go Cahal. You know what you're getting. It was a big deal. He made a similar statement a few years ago, Watson did, and they actually took away his administrative duties. And they're like, okay, we actually have to fire you. But they let him keep his honorary titles, and you think like a Nobel Prize winner should learn his lesson, right? Like you say something once, and we go, that wasn't right, so we're firing you. You think he wouldn't say it again. But he said it again, and they're like, well, we got nothing left but those honorary titles, so we're taking them. You're on your own now, buddy. But if you ever see the guy, he's out there. I don't know. So what has happened more recently? So some good stories here, right? We figured out a lot of stuff in the 20th and 21st centuries. So we figured out like about electrical and chemical messages, brain circuits and brain structures. We've solved a lot of stuff there. Treatments, right? Guess what Broca could do? Nothing. It's like, oh man, your brain's screwed up. Can you talk to me? But now it's like, oh man, your brain's screwed up. Let's try to fix it, right? And so we have all these brain-based approaches to treating disorders. Deep brain stimulation. Maybe some of you guys have heard of that. That's kind of cool. Move into the 21st century, and we get even more details. Our methodology has really improved. There was a time, some of you guys may remember this, when the U.S. government funded science. And I know, it seemed like so long ago. And I don't normally wade into politics, but geez. So there was that brain initiative. You guys remember that? What was that, like 08 or something? It's like so long ago. So that was actually really awesome for brain science, right? The president at the time said, hey, brains are cool. I think we should know more about them. And I think the way we should know more about them is to give money to folks who are figuring out new ways to study them, right? And develop new techniques and new approaches. And since that's happened, there have been some amazing things that have happened in brain science. Just in the last 6 months, they discovered a new type of brain cell that's in the human brain. I know, right? That's impressive, right? You think we've been studying human brains for a long time, chopping them up, looking at them, at least since 1906, right? Because that's when Cahal was doing his work. Over 100 years later, we're like, hey, there's like a new brain cell. We just found a new type. It's been hiding in there. And that's all because we have better microscopes. We have better analytic software. We have better, and we'll talk about methods later, pharmacological approaches. Lots of interesting things that we can do now that we could not do even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It was just a major advances in the last 15 to 20 years. Really been impressive. 2014, I think it was the last time a Nobel Prize was won by someone who was studying brains, right? So this was in physiology or medicine. This went to a group headed by Maybrit Moser and her then husband. They've been since divorced, Edvard Moser and John O'Keefe. They won a Nobel Prize for grid cells, right? So there's a way that your brain kind of sets up a map of the world, right, as you move around. They figured out how that works in rats, which is pretty impressive. and they got a Nobel Prize for that, which is pretty cool, right? So still some amazing things going on, fun stuff, and a lot more in store as we keep moving forward. There's also a major group of folks called the Society for Neuroscience. If you guys are really interested in brains and brain science, I recommend joining as a student. It's pretty cool. They have a big convention every year, always in an awesome city like Gallipolis or, no. No, it's usually in cool places like Washington, D.C., San Diego, Chicago. I've had it in New Orleans a few times, right? So places you might want to visit. Usually 25 to 30,000 people show up, so it's like a massive get-together. One of the big goals that they have right now is to get women and underrepresented groups interested in brain science and to start doing some brain science work. So I think that's a cool goal, and I think if any of you guys are interested in that, you should really pursue it, think about it, and we'll see what we can do to help you out. Questions, comments, concerns? Sasha, you okay with that 400 years of? That's what I thought. It wasn't that bad, right? It was only like 15 slides. Huh? Not too bad, yeah. I should teach history classes too, right? Just let me do that. I mean, if they're not going to let me be the pep talker, they should let me do something. I don't want to waste all my talents just on you guys. So, we've sort of covered that historical approach. Now, we left out like a major player when it comes to like science. If we were thinking about science in the 1800s, there's like one name that we should have dropped and we didn't. So the reason we didn't is because we're pulling out a whole section for Chuck D, right? So he's got his own sort of section here. I like to call him Chuck D. Nobody else does. But that's Charles Darwin. The original Chuck D, right? So I like to give everybody nicknames. So he had the idea of natural selection and evolution. I'm going to tell you what's important for this. Don't get too bogged down with it, right? But we do need to think about why is it important to think about this. One of the reasons is this idea of functionalism, right? And this is really simple. They named it almost exactly what it is. The idea is really straightforward. The best way to understand any kind of biological phenomenon or behavioral, right? Let me put the word behavioral in here. Is to understand how it's useful. What's its useful function? It's that simple. What's the purpose? What's the function? What's the usefulness of this particular behavior? Okay? And if we can think about that, we can think about that usefulness, we can think about that function a little bit, then that might give us some insight about why we behave in certain ways. Might also give us some insight into some abnormal behavior. I think the most important thing to keep in mind all the time, anytime you study a species, the important thing to think about is what will the species do in its natural environment, right? So, you guys think about psychology experiments, you think about rats, right? So what do you think about stereotypical approaches? Put a rat in a maze, see what it does, right? Okay? Well, that's a little bit of an artificial environment, right? Rats don't necessarily run around in mazes. They sort of do, right? Because they're running around always looking for things. So they're sort of in a maze, and so we can kind of think about that. We want to think about that natural environment. We think about humans, right? What do we do if we're doing a study on humans? We'll put you in a classroom, we'll give you a piece of paper with some words written on it, give you a pencil or an ink pen and say, hey, take a test, remember some words, right? Is that a natural environment for humans? It's not, right? What's a natural environment for humans? It's the savannah, right? I mean, seriously, it's the savannah of Africa. That's a natural environment for humans. And when you take humans out of that environment, you put them in a classroom, different things are going to happen, right? Some things that were extremely helpful there, not so helpful here. How many of you have attention problems? Yep, I know that, right? I can tell, because you're doing this all the time. A lot of people have some attention problems, right? Some people have it where it's like to the point you need some interventions. That's fine, right? Get what you need. Not so helpful now, right? If I say, hey, read this 300-page book and write a 10-page paper on it, having attention problems is probably not going to be helpful, right? It's going to be harmful to you. You're going to read 3 paragraphs and you're going to go, oh, wait a minute, there's a documentary about O.J. Simpson. And that's what you're going to do, right? You're just going to watch that instead. But that was extremely helpful if you were sitting around a fire, right? And all of a sudden you hear a noise and you go, hey man, what was that? And you find out it was like a pack of hyenas and you can fight them off, right? The guy who was like, I don't know, man, I'm just going to watch this fire. I'm such in deep thought about this fire. Guess what happened to him? He got eaten. And he didn't have sex with your great times whatever million grandmother to make you, right? So he didn't make it. And so all those people who were extremely contemplative, right, millennia ago, they didn't have that many offspring because they were too busy watching a fire while they were eaten by a wild animal, right? Those people with short attention spans, guess what? I'm gone, man. I saw that and I'm running. So that's what we need to think about when we think about functionalism, right? So why is something maybe we consider it pathological now might actually be something that was helpful to us at some point in our evolutionary history, right? And I think that's when you start thinking about things that way, it really makes a big difference. There are all kinds of examples that we can talk about of times where maybe there's something that's harmful in certain situations, but other situations it's helpful. And if you think about, again, that particular environment, then it makes a lot of sense. Sickle cell anemia, I think, is a great example, right? If you have sickle cell anemia, that's not such a great thing, right? And you've got there are medical interventions, things that you can take care of that. What's awesome is if you have half sickle cell anemia, right? If you only have half sickle cell anemia, right? Like, so one gene is like regular blood cells, red blood cells, and the other one are the sickle cell shape. That gives you something really great. And that gives you resistance to malaria, right? And if you could pick up resistance to malaria, doesn't that sound awesome? Especially if you were from a part of the world that has a high rate of mosquitoes with malaria, right? And if you take a map and you show on the map, here are the places where there's a lot of malaria, here's the places where there's a lot of sickle cell anemia, right? Major overlap, because it's an advantage if one of your genes gives you those sickle cell shapes, the malaria attacks those and not the good cells. So you're losing cells that don't work instead of losing cells that do work. So it's really no detriment to you. Now, you end up 25% of the time picking up sickle cell anemia, which becomes a problem for you later, but 50% of the time you just get one copy, so 50% of the time you're good to go. The other 50% of the time you get 2 good copies and you get malaria and die. So. But you got to do something, right? And so that's a time where you think, well, why do we still have a gene for sickle cell anemia? Because we still have malaria, right? And so it's still in certain populations still falling around at a high rate. So if you think about those things, you really start to think about what's that do for us. I think it really gives you a different perspective on these behaviors and things that are going on. So that's sort of the idea of functionalism, right? Like, take a moment, think about it, and think about it if you were living on the savannah. I think it's the most important thing you can do with your behavior. Like, if I was living on the savannah, why would I do that? And then you think, well, geez, that makes a lot of sense now. The other thing we want to think about is the term natural selection. People throw this around a lot. The basic idea of natural selection is you've got some kind of trait that you got from one of your parents. Might have been one that they had, or it could have been some mutation that rarely ever helps you, but maybe did this time. And it gives you some advantage. And what we mean by that advantage is it lets you in some way survive better. And by survive better, we really mean survive to the point that you can have sex with somebody, right? We're not really concerned with your survival before, right? We don't really care what you do before you have sex. But it's important getting to the point where you can procreate, right? And then you can take that trait, that genetic trait, whatever that is, and pass that on to more folks later on, right? So if it gives you a small advantage and you can have more offspring than someone else, then the next generation of folks is going to have, more likely to have that particular trait, and then of course that just keeps carrying on forward. Oh, there we go. There's Chetney. Looking great, right? People always think about him with the beard, right? I like the young Charles Darwin, right? He does. Pre-1900, right? Still there. Must have been a selective advantage for those sideburns. So, Charles Darwin, basically, there was another guy too at the same time. who sort of had an idea about evolution, and Darwin was like, oh man, I actually thought of that like a couple decades ago, but why don't we publish our papers together and see what happens? And then the other guy, everybody's forgotten his name, so it's not important. Right? No, it was important. He came about the idea independently, but whatever. Charles Darwin gets the bulk of the credit for it, as he probably should in this case. So he came up with the idea of evolution, really changed the way we think about everything. Darwin was one of the first guys to think about emotions in humans and animals. I mean, he really did a lot of things that now we're just kind of coming back around to, right? We're just now thinking about emotions in animals, right? But Darwin was like thinking about this in the 1800s. He was like, oh, bet those animals express emotions too. It's kind of cool. He had a bunch of buddies. One of those was this guy named Thomas Henry Huxley, right? This guy, I mention him because he's got an important last name, Huxley, right? He is sort of the patriarch of this really influential family. How many of you have read Brave New World? Yeah. Who's that written by?
Aldous Huxley.
Yeah, that's this guy's grandson. It's like one of his yeah, no, there you go, right? Not to mention his grandson who won a Nobel Prize for recording from squid axons. Not to mention his son who helped set up the World Wildlife Fund, and worked for the United Nations. So there's some other people in this Huxley family who are actually, pretty awesome. I also mentioned Huxley because I didn't give him this nickname. This is a nickname he picked up on his own. So it was Chuck D and Darwin's Bulldog. His nickname was Darwin's Bulldog, which is like a cool nickname, right? If somebody's going to call you a bulldog, Darwin's Bulldog is probably the one you want to be. He got this name because he was one of the biggest proponents of evolutionary thinking early on. He was one of the first guys who said, that's awesome and that's right and everybody needs to know it. So I'm just going to go out and yell about it. Problem is he didn't really understand it all. But he knew it was right, and so he just went and told people. A few years later, he started a group called the X Club. That's also a cool name, right? So he started the X Club, which was basically him and a bunch of others, sort of like, intellectuals. They would get together and have dinner once in a while. They had like mathematicians and other scientists and things. They got together. They called themselves the X Club. I don't know. Don't worry about that too much. Functionalism, we talked about that. So how does this work? When you get your genes from your parents, sometimes they get mutated, right? So they're just a little bit different. All the time, I'm going to tell you that's bad and it's going to kill you, except for that one time it didn't. Okay, so most mutations are detrimental and they're fatal. Okay, there are occasions where that mutation is going to be beneficial to you, and that's going to work. So one of the mutations that was pretty awesome for humans is we actually had a mutation. There were other hominid species at one time, and we actually got a little bit of a mutation once that let us eat 2 different kinds of grain. I know, right? Thought one grain was great, 2 grains are better. And you think, well, that's not that important. Until that first type of grain died, right? And so when all those other grains died, and we were like, we're still eating on the second kind, all the other species that could only eat that first type of grain, they starved. Okay, so we did. And so that was awesome. Not us specifically, but some ancestor of us. Gives you that little bit of advantage. And then evolution is just that slow change over time, right? And we got to think about this. If you think about things were slow when we talked about those 400 years, we're talking about millennia here, right? We're not talking about a time frame that's easy to wrap your head around. So it's a massive time frame, right? So it's that change in structure and physiology of plants and animals over time. Generally, it does produce more complex organisms, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes simpler is better. The thing to think about with evolution is there's no point to it, right? It's not about making something smarter. It's not about making something faster. It's about making something that can have more sex. That's really all that matters, okay? That's the only sort of driving force is, does it allow you to have more offspring? Does it allow you to be more attractive to mates, right? So that you can take up sort of the resources there and produce more offspring that carry your DNA going to the next generation. It's not, people think, oh, evolution is pushing us to be taller. No, it's only pushing you to be taller if that helps you have more sex, right? So at some point, things change. Now there are these examples of runaway natural selection or sex selection. We could talk about that sometime if you wanted. probably won't, because that's really all I want you to think about there. All right, only 43 slides to go. We can do that in 20 minutes. Just kidding. I gave a lecture once for 2.5 hours on 3 slides. It was impressive. It even involved a hamster. That was a fun one. I said a hamster.
Like a physical hamster?
I didn't bring a physical
Oh.
hamster. It was on the slide. So, what are we most concerned about when we think about natural selection and evolution in this class? Brains, right? I mean, this is a class sort of about brains, so we should think about brains. And that change in brain size and complexity over the evolution of our species. So you might think, like, what makes humans? I think most people would agree humans are probably the most intelligent species out there. That might not be the word you want to use. You might want to say the most cognitively advanced. Use that. That would be fine. Why we might say that is we have the most sort of flexible behavior, right? Okay. Right. I mean, compared to other species, we're able to survive in new environments. We're able to adapt to changing conditions more rapidly and be successful. And again, what's the key word we need to do there is reproduce, right? And so we can reproduce we've done a pretty good job reproducing at a rate that sort of exceeds the natural capacity of our environments. We figured ways around that, right? So we figured ways to sort of artificially boost that capability. So, what do we think about? We might think, well, what makes you smart is like, a bigger brain, right? So we want to think about absolute brain size. Okay? If you think about a rat versus a human, which is smarter? Although there are a few exceptions, we're going to go with humans on this one, right? There's sort of some individual cases there. We might argue otherwise, but go humans. And you think, well, that's absolute brain size, right? Humans have huge brains compared to rat brains, right? Rat brains are like this big. Human brains probably like this big. That makes a lot of sense. Until you start thinking about, like, elephants and whales. Now, I'm not saying elephants and whales aren't smart species. They are, but their brains are massive compared to a human brain, right? Are they that much smarter than humans? Are they smarter than humans at all, right? But they have this huge brain compared to our brain. So maybe absolute brain size isn't the best way to approach that, right? Maybe absolute brain size doesn't tell us the whole story, right? We want to think about other things. So let's think about, well, maybe it's important, like, how big your brain is compared to your body, right? The rest of your body. So that makes sense, right? Obviously, a whale is huge. It's going to have a bigger brain because it's bigger. It's got bigger everything, right? That makes sense. If you look at proportionality, human brain takes up about 2.3% of your total body weight, right? That's not so bad, right? I mean, that's respectable. If you're an elephant, it's only 0.2% of your body weight. It's like, our brain is like, 10 times bigger proportionally speaking, right? So that makes sense. It makes you feel good. Until you think about a shrew, whose brain is 3.3% of its total body weight. You think, that little shrew's got a bigger brain proportionally than I do. So then you're like, back to feeling bad, right? You're like, oh, geez. Thought it was bright. That little rodent there's got a bigger brain than I do, proportionally speaking, right? So what we want to think about is what's a better sort of approach, right? Size isn't really telling us much. Maybe it's organization, right? Maybe it's the way the human brain is organized. Maybe it's the way it's structured. So there was a group of folks a few years ago who said, I think the difference is going to be frontal cortex, right? It's like the front part of your brain. We'll talk about details later, but it's responsible for all of the cool things you do. It's not responsible for breathing and eating and walking. It's responsible for, like, planning your day, writing good research papers, advanced sort of thinking ahead and doing things. And if you think about that, you think, well, frontal cortex then, if you have a bigger frontal cortex, that's going to be important, right? Everybody, if you're a rat, if you're a lizard, if you're a human, you've got to breathe, you've got to eat. So those parts of the brains probably, it shouldn't count, right? Because it's not really adding anything to your cognitive capacity. So what? You can eat. Big deal, right? Let's think frontal cortex. So you start looking at frontal cortex, and what you notice is that humans and primates have much larger frontal cortexes than any other species, right? Our frontal cortex is huge compared to the rest of our brain. What's also interesting is some folks started looking at, well, what's in that frontal cortex, right? And there are different kinds of brain cells. We'll talk about them. There are neurons. These are the guys who really do the calculations. And then you've got a lot of support cells, right, that are just making sure everything's healthy. If you're really wanting to do some advanced work, you should have a higher concentration of those neurons that are actually doing the heavy lifting, right? Support cells don't matter so much, okay? You've got some, as long as you got enough to keep everything running, that's great. But you want a high density of neurons, right? So if you start taking mammals and you start plucking out bits of their frontal cortex, you start looking at the density of neurons, what you find is that humans have the highest density of neurons in their frontal cortex. Sort of right behind us are the other great apes, right? Chimpanzees, gorillas, and bonobos. You go back a little bit, you start having other primates, you get out of the apes, you get into monkeys. Talk about differences in apes and monkeys later. It's another big takeaway for today. I want you to walk out of here and call chimpanzees monkeys. I'll fail you. I promise you. It's on record. But as you go, and then you get down to like, what's another mammal? Like a rabbit. It's got a frontal cortex, but it's smaller. Density of neurons is lower, right? So it's that density of neurons in the frontal cortex. That's really what gives you that more powerful brain, right? And so if we use that, it's a pretty objective measure, makes a lot of sense. That does kind of put humans at the top. So that's pretty cool, right? So there you go. Now you feel good, right? You can walk out here knowing you're the smartest species on the planet. Also the one responsible for destroying it, but that's a whole separate story. You got that going for you too. So what are things that require a large brain, right? Tool use. That's an obvious one, right? Tool use. If you're going to use a tool to do something, there are very, very few species in the world that use tools. And I don't mean like tools like wrenches and screwdrivers. I mean like anything, like a pry bar. You guys have seen the chimpanzees take the sticks and put them in the termite mounds, right? And pull out that's a tool. That's what that is, right? It's a tool. So chimpanzees will use tools. There are some birds that do it as well. There's some weird exceptions there. Most species don't do that. You need a bigger brain for tool use. Color vision. You wouldn't think color vision, but if you have color vision, you're multiplying the channels, right? We have red, green, and blue. We'll talk about that later. Red, green, and blue. So you have to kind of multiply by 3 the amount of visual information you're receiving. So you need more structures to handle that. Makes some sense. We're going to skip down a couple and talk about language. Humans have the most complex language, right? Other species do communicate with each other, but not with the depth and richness that we do. So obviously communication, language, you have to have a bigger brain for that. Fire and upright posture. These are actually two kind of interesting things that folks don't think about a lot when they think about why you would need a big brain. Walking upright is probably the single most important development in the history of the human species. There's been nothing else as important as walking upright. You should write that down. You should tattoo it on your chest. It's that. Seriously, right there under your ex-lover's name. Just mark that out. Put walking upright, because that's your new love, right over your heart. The reason walking upright is so important is, so we're back on that savanna, and you're down on all fours. Guess what you're not seeing? Above the grass, yeah. So basically anything, right? So once you get upright, you look over the grass. That's awesome. You can see not only predators approaching you, but you can see food sources from a distance, right? The other amazing thing that walking upright has done for us is we are probably one of the best running species on the planet. And I know somebody's going to say, what about those cheetahs? You only have to outrun a cheetah for 4 seconds, and then it's dead. Okay? Cheetahs are super fast for a short period of time. They got one burst. If they don't catch something, they got to take a break. And that's it. How far and how fast can humans run?
Virtually forever.
Yeah, some of those idiots run 50 miles, right? Why are you running 50 miles? They make scooters. Just to do it. They make scooters. That's we big brain. We got a scooter now. Do that. So yeah, you can run. I don't know. There was this guy Bernd Heinrich. I don't know if you guys know Bernd Heinrich. He's actually got a PhD in physiology, and he also, at least for a while, held the world record for the longest distance anybody had run in a 24-hour period. He ran like 134 miles in a 24-hour period. which should show you how great of a species we are. So we got these awesome hips, right? And we're going to talk more about hips later. But our hips and our legs are structured in a way that we can cover long distances very quickly. And that's awesome. So we can get to new food sources. We can get away from danger. We can do a lot of cool things. The other thing it really did for us is it allowed us, I think, the greatest invention in the history, not development biologically speaking, but invention, was pockets. If you're not walking upright, you can't stick your hands in your pockets, right? And just walking around like that, I mean, hands in pockets. But the cool thing is you have two free hands now, right? And with two free hands, you can carry things from one location to another, right? It's not about, man, I found an awesome stick here. I'm going to use it to dig a hole. I found an awesome stick here. I can use it to dig a hole over there. Because I can pick up that stick and I can carry it with me. And that's amazing. And I know it doesn't sound amazing. You're like, carry a stick. Whoa, my dog does that. Yeah, but your dog doesn't do it the same way, right? It's a different kind of story. Okay, so using your hands, free hands, two free hands, awesome. It allowed us to do like overhand throws. Oh man, overhand throws are awesome. The reason they're awesome is because, have you ever watched a baseball game from the 1880s? It's all underhand. You know, that's no good. You know, these guys just like lobbing them in. You start throwing overhand, you don't have Nolan Ryan if you can't do overhand throws, right? And so that was impressive. Overhand throws are much more accurate, they're much faster. Not only are they great for like striking out batters, they're really great for, is there a leak?
It's just the water.
Just the water? Well, I wouldn't sit in this row next time. Is it the acid pipe? No. That was a joke. But it's also great for throwing things at food sources, right? Because you can throw a spear, you can throw a rock, you know, with some accuracy and some deadly force. So upright posture, amazing. Okay. And then fire, it's like a whole story about fire. The cool thing about fire is we can cook our food now, right? Cooked food is actually slightly easier to digest. There's some interesting stories there about this guy who ate a raw goat. But yeah, you guys want to hear the raw goat story? That's a fun one. So there's always been this big debate, right? Like which came first, big brains or fire? And everybody's like, well, it's got to be fire because you can't have big brains without that food source, right? Because your brain is just like this resource hog, right? You put in resources, it goes to your brain, right? And this is what happens, okay? They're like, well, fire because you can cook your food now, it's easier to eat, right? And you can like kind of swallow that, and you can digest it faster, you can get more nutrients, you can develop those big brains, they can grow and do all that fun stuff. There's this guy in Australia who was like, well, I don't know about that. So here's how we're going to figure it out. I'm going to grow me a goat in the lab. Seems reasonable. Now the interesting thing is it was a sterile goat. And I don't mean sterile like it didn't have offspring. I mean it was like in a sterile environment. Because how many of you eat raw meat? Yeah, nobody, right? Because there was a guy who ate raw meat. He sat right over there. He's either in the bathroom or the hospital right now. Because that's what raw meat will do to you, right? They're parasites. It'll make you sick. Right? We cook our meat. He's like, well, I'm going to grow this goat. I'm just going to let it. And then I'm going to kill it. I'm going to butcher it. And I'm going to eat it and see what happens. This guy was hardcore. He even used stone tools to cut the goat. I know, right? I mean, it's like, this guy was serious. So he cut open cut the goat, and he figured out, like, if you cut it right in the small enough pieces, actually raw meat is just as easy to digest as cooked meat. And so maybe, we don't know, maybe big brains came first because we were chopping up our meat really small, and we could support the big brains. And then later we're like, man, there's an easier way to do this. I think it's fire. Let's try that. But maybe it was still fire first. I don't know, right? It's like a really cool story, though. And I know you guys aren't as thrilled about that as I am, but maybe one of you gets excited about raw goat meat. It's pretty cool. Casey, wait till I tell them about the sheep and the trench coats. Yeah, you think goats are cool. Halloween sheep. So, upright posture, fire, amazing. The other thing that humans kind of have is something called neoteny. And we need to talk about this. So neoteny is this really slow maturation, right? How many of you have ever seen a baby? They're useless, right? They're these like wads of flesh, and they just go all the time. And it's like something's coming out of every hole it's got. I don't know what, Okay, so first thing is don't make more of them. We got too many babies as it is. So you guys do other things, get a dog, right? play video games. I don't know what you do with your time. So we don't need more kids. Unless your kids are going to be really productive workers and they'll pay into Social Security. Then it's okay if you have kids, because we need some people to support my Social Security when I retire. I write that down. Otherwise, don't even think about it. So, we all shot out of a uterus as a big lump of flesh that was useless. And we were useless for a very long period of time, right? And if I ask your parents, some of you, they may still say you're useless, right? It's okay. Just keep moving forward. How many of you have ever seen a horse that was born? If that thing's not up in 2 minutes running the Kentucky Derby, it's dead, right? That's what they fought, which, by the way, I mean, I'm thinking like, one, shooting anything out of a uterus has got to be painful. But if that thing has hooves, right? That's got to be even more painful. So thankfully humans don't have hooves, right? Or none of you would be here. I can just imagine my mom going, this thing's going to have hooves? I don't think so. So, the horse comes out, pops up, and it's got to be walking really like in 2 minutes, right? If the horse isn't up in a couple minutes and it's not up doing its business, it's probably not going to live. It's going to die. If a human's not up in 2 minutes walking, it's fine, right? If a human's not walking within maybe 2 years, you start to get worried, right? I mean, I don't know when kids start walking. Year and a half? Does that seem reasonable? Yeah, so you got a year to get up and walk. You give a horse 2 minutes. It's neoteny. It's a slow maturation process. Now, the important thing about this is this lets you have a big brain. Okay? So remember that time I told you where babies come from, right? And for those of you that don't know where a uterus is, look it up on Google. Okay? It's not in a comfortable place, right? It's not in a comfortable place to shoot out 10 pounds. Is that how big? I think that's how big babies are. That's how big I'm going to tell you they are, 10 pounds. 15 pounds?
I think closer to 6, 7.
Really? Now I know why I only have one sister. So, I thought 10 pounds was whatever. I'll keep telling you 10 pounds. It will keep you from having kids, right? Even those of you that don't have a uterus, you're getting cramps. Because you're thinking, that's rough. So, we're going to shoot this ball of flesh, right, out of you. Now, if I asked your mothers, would you want your child to have a bigger head? How many of your mothers would say yes? Like none of them. None of them would say, yes, if my child had a bigger head when it was born, that would have made me happy. Right? Nobody would say that because of where the babies shoot out of the body, right? So, because our hips, remember that time I told you about hips? And I said our hips are positioned and structured in a way to make us extremely efficient runners, right? If we had wider hips, we could have bigger heads, right? Because it'd be easier to get a larger baby out, okay? We'd be born with bigger, imagine that. We'd have really big heads, right? That'd be awesome. Okay? Instead, we have this other process called neoteny. We're born with these sort of squishy, undeveloped heads that'll fit out between normal set of hips, right? And then later the head gets bigger. That makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more comfortable on everybody, right? Because we're at this balancing point where if our hips get bigger, we start to lose that efficiency in locomotion, right? Our heads can get bigger, maybe our brains can get bigger, and that might be good. So I don't know. We don't really want to lose that efficiency in walking. Maybe over time, right? So now you're thinking about it like, well, how long is it going to take for the average human hip to get wider? Right? You guys ever think about this? I do this sometimes in my head. Because I think like, how long did it take for us to get the hip size we have now? Right? How many millennia of us not having to run from things, like because we have scooters, is it going to take before we can have bigger headed babies because we have wider hips? Because we're not as concerned about being as efficient with our running. So if you think about like a gorilla, right? I mean, a gorilla has a wider set of hips. Very rarely, if ever, has there been a complication in a gorilla birth, right? So we hardly ever see problems with gorilla births. There was this gorilla C-section once, like a year ago. It was like the most amazing thing ever. They had to call in a regular obstetrician, like a human obstetrician, because nobody's ever done a gorilla C-section. Because there's no need for it, right? Because gorilla babies, they just, wider hips, they come right out. No problem, you know. Humans, it doesn't work that way. Human birth is very, very arduous, right? It's a very difficult process because we tried to have these giant heads, but yet still fairly narrow hips. And so we're right at the edge where if the hips are a little narrow or the head's a little big, it's going to cause some more problems, and you can really run into difficulties. That's exciting, right? How many of you are going to... No, I'm not going to ask that. That was a little personal, but we'll we'll see. This isn't too important except this branch coming up here, right? These are apes. Okay, and there are some big differences and a lot of differences between apes and monkeys, okay? The major difference that I'm going to tell you about is tails. If it has a tail, it's a monkey. If it doesn't have a tail, it's an ape. It's that simple. Chimpanzee, no tail. That makes it an ape. Don't call chimpanzees monkeys. People do it all the time. None of you will do it. So we've got our great apes, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, the humans. There's another species here, the bonobo, we'll talk a lot about later. Orangutans are up there. Gibbons are known as lesser apes. They're still pretty awesome, right? Lots of gibbons. Mammal brain sizes, don't worry about that too much. This is sort of interesting. This is a relationship between body weight and brain size. This is sort of like the human lineage here. These are other like species that exist now, chimpanzees, gorillas. You kind of see the human branch kind of took off, right? And we have big brains. Actually, Neanderthals have a slightly larger brain than we did, or had a larger brain than we did, which is kind of interesting. So maybe bigger brains isn't the best, right? What happened to those guys? They were too nice and we killed them. No, they had huge frontal lobes, which is like what makes them social. And then we have slightly smaller frontal lobes, so we probably just went in and stabbed them. And it's Neanderthal. Please don't pronounce the H. It's a German word, right? For like, it's Neander Valley. It's not like Neander, I don't know, thal, what that is. But it's tall. And it's also like Cro-Magnon, because it's a French word. It's not Cro-Magnon, so Cro-Magnon, let's do that one too. For those of you that weren't up on that. But now you are, and now you know. And knowing's half the battle. We already talked about that. Oh, ethical treatment. I got 25 seconds. There are anywhere between 3 and 8 government entities and non-government entities that might come in and check on your research when you're doing animal research, right? So everything is on the up and up. Everything we talk about that's like current modern stuff definitely went through like tons of checks to make sure people could do it. That stuff we talked about in the like 16, 17, 1800s, not so much, but it's a little hard to get mad at somebody 200 years ago for a rule that didn't exist. So I'm gonna let that one go. That's it.
Except in China, right? You can do whatever they want.
I'm talking developed Western countries. Yeah, China's a different story. They've got a different set of rules.